So now that we have all these resources available to us, the only thing we don't have yet is the ability to limit the types of resources that various different kinds of users can access. Or maybe if I take my laptop home, maybe I want to limit the resources that I get when I'm at home. We're going to cover all of that in Lesson 3. One thing I also like to point out is everything we cover in Lesson 2 and 4 only apply to the SSL VPN type of deployment scenario, when I've got APM acting as an actual SSL VPN. So nothing we just covered in the last lesson applies if all I'm doing is doing authentication for my virtual server pool. We're not going to create webtops and all that. In Lesson 4, it only applies to the SLVPN. However, in Lesson 3, everything we're going to cover here applies to both of those deployment scenarios. SSL VPN, user identity and access management for all of our LTM stuff. So the first thing we're going to be using in this section is a AAA server, which I think you might have brought that up in your presentation. AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. So authentication means we can have the user supply any kinds of credentials, whether it's radius, tokens, one-time passwords, whatever we want. And then APM will always, in most cases, will send that authentication request to the back-end server, and all it's looking for is one of two answers, successful or not successful. If it's successful, it goes to the successful branch. If it's not, it goes that fallback branch. Then we also can take that username and do a query, an authorization query that we send to a server. In this case, we're sending it to the same server. It doesn't always have to be the same server, but in most cases it probably usually is. And so all APM is saying is, tell me everything you know about this user. Have any of you ever been Active Directory administrators before, adding usernames, user accounts into Active Directory? Well, if you've done that, or if you go into the Active Directory server in your environment, you'll see that every user account has a variety of tabs of details we can provide about them. Their phone number, their email address, their address, all these pieces of information, which most administrators never fill in. But the other thing we also specify is the groups they're in, which groups. So we send this query and we say, tell me everything you know about the user. We get all this information back in the query, and then we can use that information the entire time they're logged on in our session. So I can continue to make decisions using any of that information from the query. So we only have to make one query per session, and that's all we have. And then we can make all of our decisions later. And then we can also send information about their login to our Radius accounting server. So that's how we're going to use those three items. Now, one of the things that I really like, oh, it's not working. One of the things I really like, another thing that I really like about APM is this. And I think this is a good thing for you to always bring up with your customers. When I was at Aventail, we announced a new feature, which was the two-factor authentication. So at one point, we only had one type of authentication for users and a VPN. It had a second. Oh, great. And the way it was configured was, in your authentication type, there was like a little checkbox. Do you want another second? And you say yes, and so now you had a second one. It was very static. It was very rigid on how it was set up. In APM, not the case. So for example, I can have an AD auth item, and if they're successful, then I could maybe go do a radius as well. And if they're successful, I could also ask for a one-time password. Or if they don't succeed here, maybe I can check their credentials in another Active Directory server. Or maybe this is where I'll do the one-time password. The way I set up my two-factor or multi-factor authentication, again, there's no wrong way to do this. It's just whatever you want. all of this flexibility, I think, is really valuable. All we need to have is multiple AAA servers set up on the BIG-IP, on APM. So that will require you to understand a bit about some of these different authentication server types. Oh, I guess I missed that one. My animation, sending it to the accounting server. So another example here of the multi-factor authentication. The user supplies all that information right from the get-go. They don't have to have multiple login pages. We have one login page that has their username and password, their radius PIN, their one-time password. They fill it all in at one time. And then we start sending it back to whoever we need to send it to. Now, for whatever reason, this administrator wanted to authenticate them with both Active Directory and LDAP. So once we get the success there, we move on to the next item. And now we check it on the LDAP and make sure that is successful. Now, this is just an example. And then once that's successful, our third is to send that PIN number to the radius server to see if that becomes successful. So again, only if they supply all three of these do we then move on to the branch to see what's next. So no wrong way to do this. So as I said, I leave it up to you to come here under Authentication and examine and understand and work with all these authentication types. I don't know anything about this authentication type or that one. So, and this list gets bigger and bigger with every new release. So definitely something for you to explore more as you leave boot camp. We're going to work primarily with Active Directory. So here's an example of an Active Directory configure. Actually, no, I'm sorry. This is a radius configuration page. And I'm just showing you this so that you can see that every authentication server type will have its own set of options that you have to set up and configure, which again will require you to understand a little bit about that. So now I've got my AAA server set up, or more than one. So now I need to add it to my visual policy editor. You'll notice in this visual policy editor currently, we're not doing any authentication. Authentication isn't required with APM. It's just an option with APM. But we've decided to add it. So I'm going to use that little plus sign before Advanced Resource Assign to add a new item. This is the dialog box I was talking about a few moments ago before in the last lesson. This is all the things we can do inside this visual policy editor. Do you remember earlier when I was looking at the access profile page where I could put in the maximum sessions per user? And when we created the profile, I said just use the all option. If you don't know what you need, just use the all option. If I picked different options in that list, it would limit the options available in here. So I say just choose all, and then I can pick and choose what I want in here. But specifically, we want the logon page item. So you guys already played with the logon page item in both of your last two exercises. That's where you put in your username and password. And I also had you customize that just a little bit. So a few things we can do in terms of customizing. First off, if you wanted to, we could change these session variables, but I don't recommend it. So this is where we're going to create session variables for all the different username, password, whatever, because we're going to use those for single sign-on. And if I change these variables, then I have to remember to change the variables on all the other screens that I'm going to configure for single sign-on. But I can also add additional fields. I'm going to need a field for my radius PIN because I want them to be able to fill that out on the same logon page. So I can add additional fields to the page. Anybody know the difference between a text type field and a password type field? Is what? Hidden. Yeah. When you type it in, you can't see what you're typing. Exactly. So I'm going to make this a password type field. I'm going to call it PIN, and pretty easy to do. There are other types. I think there's like a checkbox type maybe. I don't know. You have to play with those. So that's the fields. Then down at the bottom, these are all of the display options, what we're going to see on the page. So earlier I had you change that to customize it. A nice simple thing you can do in a customer demo and show them. Actually, two things you can do in the customer demo that are really cool is what you just did in your last exercise. You could customize a web top if you just get a copy of their logo, and you can go get a copy of their logo on Google Images before your demo. And look, I just created a custom web top for you and custom logon page. That's kind of cool. And then as you guys did, you changed some of these values, but notice I now have a new input label for my new field I just created, so I can fill that in as well. All right, so that's the first item, is our logon page. And then the next item is my actual authentication item itself. So remember, the login page, I'm just getting information. Now I'm going to have an item that sends the information to the AAA server we already have configured. So I'll add that item right after the logon page. Then I'm going to go to my Authentication tab of objects. And all of these items that have the red arrows, those are all authentication item types. Anything that can do authentication of all the different options that you saw a little bit ago on that other screenshot. So we're going to choose AD, because most of us understand AD pretty well. And then I come to this screen here. And on this screen, there's really only one thing you have to configure, and in most cases, only one thing you're going to configure, which is the AAA server that we're using. And as you saw in your last exercise, you can reuse the same AD server object you already created. You can reuse that in multiple different policies. So I'm going to select my AD server, and everything else on there really are just a couple of configurations. You know, how many maximum logons can they try before I don't let them try anymore. But it doesn't lock them out. This is not a lockout feature with AD. So now I've got the first two steps. And I might want to put under the fallback branch, this is where I might put a message box explaining why they're being turned away. So the next one here is my authorization item. Let me go back just for a second. So now that I know who they are, this is where I'll send the query to the Active Directory server. So I'm going to do that after my AD auth. We only have two querying options, one for Active Directory and one for LDAP. Those are the only two server types that actually store data about a user. And we're going to choose Active Directory. Similarly to the AD auth, the first thing we have to specify is which AAA server are we going to send this to. And as I said earlier, more often than not, it's going to be the same AAA server that authenticated them. And then there's a couple of other fields here, like, before I go to that, there's a couple other fields here, like search filter is a valuable field to understand. The idea here is we're now querying a database. Before I just said, is this username and password, yes or no? It's pretty quick. But now I'm querying a huge database. And it might be a huge database. If it's Lorax, they might have, 50,000 users in there. And so doing this query might have a little bit of latency. So in the search filter, we can actually just define a subset of the Active Directory server that we're going to search in. So we can make that a little bit quicker of a search. Another thing that's kind of interesting, and this is new in V13, this actually really threw me in my exercise. I think it was 2 boot camps ago. It was the first time I started doing V13 exercises. And I had some steps in your next exercise where users were calling me over going, I don't see this information. I don't see the user's manager feed that's supposed to come back from the Active Directory server. And I don't see their email address. And I was like, I don't know why it's changed. I'm looking, I'm confused. Well, that's because they added this. This is new. So now you define only those Active Directory attributes, the fields that are going to be sent back in the query. And you'll notice user manager is not here. Their address isn't here. So that's why. So you could actually add more if you wanted more sent back in the query. But more often than not, this is all you need sent back. Specifically, the member of is down there. Member of is the important one because that's their group memberships. Now, this item is a little bit different from the auth item. The auth item, we're just checking a yes or no. Do they have successful logon? Yes or no? In this one, I'm just getting a query, but I've got to do something with it. There's no yes or no here. So this is the first time where we have to come over to the branch rules tab, because I have to define, how do I get out of this branch now? What do I do when I leave this branch? And there's a default branch rule here, which says the user's primary group is 100. And that's rarely, if ever, going to apply to any of your customers' environments. So this default branch rule you're never going to use. We have to change that, or else nobody's going to leave this branch, or this item, excuse me. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete that item, that branch, and we're going to create a new one with the add branch rule. Now this is another place where you can maybe start seeing ahead, picturing. We can create branches using all of these items. So for example, I might have an item that gets my IP address. And then I can have different branch rules for the IP subnet I'm in. And that's how I can identify if the user's connecting from the corporate office or not. So if they're not connecting from the corporate office, I know they're out of the office somewhere. So when I take my laptop home, I go into a different branch. So there's just, again, no limit to how you can set these up. It's really just a matter of discovering all the options slowly. What we're going to do is we're going to use the AD query agent, the agent select, and then in this case there's a couple of conditions, but the way that I'm recommending it, the way that most of us recommend it, is all I'm going to do at this time is send the query and get the data back, and that's all I want to do here. That's it. And so the condition I'm going to use is we got query data back. The query passed. We got a successful set of data back. That's the only branch I want here in this particular item. And then I'm going to change the name of that branch as well. And so now it'll look like that. Now it'll be, nothing's working on my controller. Now it'll say they get their login credentials. Then they get sent to the AAA, to the Active Directory server. If that's successful, then they're going to query that user. And as long as that user gets, that username has something that's sent back, we move on. But you'll notice that once I added this new item with a new branch, because I deleted the old branch and I created a new one, I now have a new branch coming out of there. And that new branch defaulted to a deny ending. Why do you suppose APM does that? Because well, what were we saying on, I think it was Thursday, about the general rule of security? We always want to err on the side of more secure than less secure. So we don't want users to make any accidental mistakes. So we have to change that ending ourselves to allow. Like that. Very easy to do. So now I know information about the user. This is when it gets exciting. So now I know the groups they're in and any other Active Directory attributes that might be sent back. But again, more often than not, we're just going to use their group information. So now I'm going to add another item that you guys already have in yours, the Advanced Resource Assign. The Advanced Resource Assign was added about, I think in V12 is when we added this. And it changed the game a bit from the original resource assign. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a moment. So first off, I'm going to add a new item. After we query them successfully, I'm going to add a new item. And under my assignment tab, you'll see we have the Advanced Resource Assign. We also have one called Resource Assign. That's the old one. This is the old Resource Assign that doesn't do nearly what our new Advanced Resource Assign does. And so I'm going to encourage you to always use Advanced. And we'll talk about what it does here in just another second. But there is a big difference between those two. So I'm going to choose Advanced Resource Assign. And then I'm going to choose Add New Entry. Now this is kind of what yours looked like when you went in there at first. First time you went into Advanced Resource Assign, it kind of looked like that, except there were a couple of resources defined under there. And you were using the Add Delete button, the Add Delete link. There was also this thing above it called expression that you might have maybe you noticed it, maybe you didn't. You kind of might have wondered what that was. Well, we're going to cover what that is now. But first, the add delete, this is how we're going to define what users are going to get access to. What all resources, like you did in your last exercises. What resources do they get? The expression is where we define the who. Who gets access to the resources here? And that's what's new, that's what's different about this, is we can do both the authorization and the resource assignment in this one item. That wasn't the case before with our old resource assign. So first we'll do the easy part, what you already just did in your last exercise. We'll go to the add delete. We've got all the resources, you guys have already done this, and now I've got the resources. Now these are only the resources for my administrators. Ooh, should do that. My administrators. Or maybe this is my employees. I think this is my employees, what my employees get. So now I'm going to go to that change option for the expression. So once again, I'm going to use the agent called AD query because I'm going to use the information. That's how we use the information that we have already received from the query. But this time I'm going to use a different condition. I'm going to use the condition user is a member of. And then I need to put, oh, this is my administrator's access. Then I need to put the group name in LDAP syntax. That's probably the most challenging part of this step, is getting the correct LDAP syntax for the groups that you're dealing with. There's two ways we can do this. One is we can go to our Active Directory administrator and say, hey, what is the group name? Give me the whole LDAP syntax. They have a tool on their Active Directory server that they can get all that. Email it to you, boom, done. But here's something else you can do that's kind of cool, is you can actually go at any time and you can look at all the users that are logged on and you can see all this information about them. So once we have the querying being done, the AD query, I can now have a user log in. I can say, Marcel, go log in. He can log in. Then I can go look at his session and I can see everything APM learned about him, including all of the Active Directory attributes that were sent back about his account, which includes his group membership in LDAP syntax. And you can literally copy and paste from there to this screen here. So that's kind of cool. You'll do that in your exercise. You can see that. So once I have this and I click on that add expression, now it looks like this. So if I left this like this, now if an employee, salesperson logged in, they're going to get a dead page because they're not going to pass through here. They're going to pass through the authentication and the query. They're going to come to this item. They're not going to match that. They're going to go to the fallback branch for this item, which is deny. So I have to make sure to add some more items. So I can use the add new entry, do this again for another group, do it again for another group, and so on until I have my list of items, all of my different groups. So you notice up here I've got my administrators getting some access, my employees getting some access, then I've got contractors, what they can do, and then at the top you'll notice I have an expression that combines different groups because my vendors and my partners, correct? My vendors and my partners, they both get the same resources. So I don't need to create two separate expression entries. I can just use the OR statement for both of them. Now you'll notice these are in an order. And I've got all these different options to move them. In most cases, I'm just going to tell you this and I won't explain why at the moment. In most cases, the order here may not matter. And like I said, I'll explain why in a moment. But there's one condition where the order might matter. And we talked about it earlier today. Remember I was telling you that we could have more than one web top created. So I could have a web top for my partners, I could have a web top for my employees, and so forth. Well, every time I log in, I can only have one web top assigned to me. That's it. But you'll notice each one of these has a web top assigned. My admin web top, my employee web top, and so forth. So the web top I get will be the first web top I match going down this list. So if I wanted to ensure that my administrators always got the administrator web top, I might want to move them up. I can't remember if I do that in the slide or not. Oh, I guess I didn't, but I should. Now, what I was just referring to a moment ago, where I said there's something very different about this page than there is from branches. Remember we talked about branches. I told you that we match the first branch, we go the first branch we match, and that's it. This is very different. Here's an explanation of kind of how this is different. So Bob logs on, and Bob is a contractor. So Bob will only get those resources. He doesn't match anything else here. And then I have, I think, Fred, Joan logging in, and Joan all she is a standard employee, so she's going to get those resources. And then Fred logs in, and Fred is one of our partner administrators like Erica. She manages our partner programs, or he manages our partner programs, and as a result he's in our partners group, so he can get all the stuff that our partners get. He's also in the employees group. So because he's in the partners group, he's going to get all of those resources, and because he's in the employees group, he's going to also get these. So he will effectively get all the resources in purple. So that's why the order doesn't always really matter, because I will always get all the resources that are available to me, but it does matter when it comes to the web top idea, because I only will get one web top. Any questions about that? So that's where I moved them around. It's not perfect, but now I have employees at the top because of the web top issue. All right, so now we've covered authentication and authorization, and the last part of this lesson is the endpoint checks and client-side actions. So again, the idea of endpoint checks is this is where I can define specific attributes about the devices that users are connecting from. So again, I've already told you that in my environment, we want Windows users, so we only say McAfee firewall, Microsoft firewall, or I'm sorry, McAfee antivirus, Windows firewall, Microsoft Windows firewall, and we want a certificate installed on the laptop so that I know it's corporate assigned, corporate issued. So now when users connect, one of the first things they need to do is be interrogated. Got to interrogate that machine, and we do that with an agent. So this is something else that requires an agent to be able to run, because we can't interrogate without the computer's approval. But now that agent's going to do the interrogation and find out if the computer, the device, matches all those requirements, and if they do, they can then log in. Now that has to do with where they place the checks in the policy. I always recommend placing the checks before the logon page. That's just me. So that way if they don't pass one of the checks, I don't have to bother them with the logon. This user tries to connect from a Macintosh with this Java agent and fails the very first check because they don't even have the right antivirus. So at that point, they're not going to keep going in the policy. They're just going to be done and fail, and they don't get to log in. But unfortunately, I've been told we have to start allowing Mac users, so I'm going to have to make some changes. But before we get into that, let's talk about a second type of endpoint checking. So the first was called client-side checks. The second one is called server-side checks, which sounds like it has something to do with the web server, but it has nothing to do with the web server. I actually don't like the name of this. I think it's misleading. But let's explain what this is and how it's different. Now I'm going to add some additional requirements for the connection, such as their operating system of their device. Notice I've added Mac. Their IP address based in region, the geolocation regions that we have, and date and time. I only want people connecting during work hours. So here's the big difference between client-side and server-side checks. So now the user makes their initial request. I want to connect to the VPN. Well, in that request, when you send a request to a server, you include information about yourself in the headers. And all of this information we can get from that header details, meaning we don't have to go and examine and scan their laptop this time. So all of that information can be done, or it can be examined without having to do any interrogation and without any agents on the devices, which is nice. So they've passed all those. Now, of course, we can do a combination. I can check their antivirus, their Windows firewall, their operating system, and so forth and so on. So no agents. Makes them real nice to work with. And then again, if they pass all the checks, they can log on. This user connects, and they do have a Mac OS, which is great. However, they're connecting from UK right now, and therefore they're not going to pass that second check. The way these are configured, the client-side checks and the server-side checks are very different. So let's take a look at them. Sorry, you can't log on. So let's start with the client-side checks. And as I said, I'm going to add these before the logon page, because I think it makes it easier for users. So all of these are going to be under our client-side security. So what it's called, client endpoint security client-side. So these are all the client-side checks we can do. Antivirus, Windows firewall, certificates, files, Windows files, registry entries, and so forth. One of the questions I used to get a lot is, aside from using certificates, how can we identify corporate laptops, corporate computers? And what I always recommend is when your IT department is building out the laptops, they can just create a text file inside the Windows folder, just call it file.txt, I don't care what it's called, and then search for that file. And if it's in that right folder, then we know we put it there. Now, does that prevent somebody from adding that file? Not really. However, we can also apply a checksum value to it so that we know the exact file. So if somebody tried to create their own file, it wouldn't match. But how many users scan through their Windows folder and they wouldn't even know what that file was for anyway? So it's definitely something you could use for checking. But I'm going to select my antivirus for this one. Now what we can do is a couple things we can do here. One is we can add an additional feature that was added a couple of releases ago that basically says, all right, I'm going to interrogate you to see when you're connecting if you have the antivirus. You do? Great. Now you can be connected for 10 hours and I no longer know what you've done or what your computer looks like. And if you disable your antivirus software, I have no idea of knowing that. Or I can enable this feature that says, even after our session is established, I will continue to reach out and check your device and see if you still match this criteria. And if for some reason you disabled your antivirus, I will disable your session. And then down below that, we can add any number of acceptable antivirus programs based on the platform, the vendor, the type, and number of days since they've updated their signatures, versions, everything. And as long as the device has one of these installed, they're good to go. So I told you that client-side and server-side checks are very different in how you configure them. And what I mean by that is all of your client-side checks. I'll take your battery. There we go. All of your client-side checks are like an auth item. Remember that an auth item just checks for something and it's either yes or no. So same thing here. I'm just checking to see if they have one of these, yes or no. If they have yes, they're going to go successful branch. If they don't, they're going to go fallback branch. That's how these are configured. And that's what I just said. Now again, I might want to consider a nice message box to explain why they may be failing this. It might look kind of like, oh, and then maybe a different ending. So instead of just denying them, I could send them to a web page to give them some remediation, so it might look kind of like that. So now I want to add a server-side check. I want to see information about their operating system. So I'll do that after their antivirus. So only if they match antivirus will they move on to the check of their OS. So these are all on the server side. So again, these are all things we can check from just their initial request without any interrogation. So I'm going to choose Client OS. Now what's interesting is you'll notice as soon as I click on save, or no, as soon as I click on add item, on the background you can see a lot's just happened. Because by default, all of these items have some predefined branches already defined for us. The date and time has some predefined branches. They all have predefined branches. We don't have to live with the predefined branches. I don't want branches for Mac OS, Linux, Windows Phone, Chrome OS, and so on and so forth. But this is where that difference between client-side checks and server-side checks is very different. Client-side checks, you look for a bunch of stuff and then make a decision yes or no. Server-side checks, you don't look for anything. I'm not looking for anything. I'm just going to examine something of theirs and send them to a branch that they match. That's how the big difference is between them. So I got nothing to configure on the first page. The branch rules is where all the work is done. So again, these are all the default branches. I definitely don't need all of those Windows operating systems, and I don't need a lot of these. So I'm going to customize it to look more like this. Delete out a bunch of those, and then I'm going to clear out a bunch of those Windows operating system types. I am going to allow Macs in, because I've already been told I had to, and then I'll save that. So now, all of my Windows users are going to go the original branch that we once created earlier, with all of the authentication, authorization, the resources for employees and contractors and so forth. And all of my Mac users are going to go here. And I may have to recreate all of that. But what if I didn't need anything different for my Windows and Mac users? I just wanted to know if they were Windows or Mac users. I don't want to recreate a whole branch. So we don't have to do that, of course. We can go back into Client OS, and I can delete the old Mac branch, and then I can just add the Mac OS to that Windows branch. Easy to do that, no problem. And I'll also want to change the name of the branch from Windows to Windows or Mac. And now it'll look like that. So now if they're in Windows or Mac, they'll go to the first branch. If not, they'll go to the fallback branch. And again, maybe a message box like that. Sorry, you don't have Windows or Mac. No access at this time for you. I was just watching an old clip of, some of you aren't going to know this reference, Seinfeld. You remember Seinfeld? No soup for you. No soup for you. No resource for you. All right, so now the last thing, and then we can do our exercise, and it's lunchtime and so forth, is client-side actions. As I said earlier, this is designed to clear out evidence of their session from their device. More often than not done from when they're not connecting from a corporate device. More often than not. I typically will do these at the end, after their resource assign. So I'll add an item here. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Remember that in that advanced resource assign, we have 5 different kinds of groups. We have our administrators, our employees, our contractors, vendors, and partners. But only my employees and contractors should be getting client-side actions. But I only have one branch coming out of that item. So how am I going to differentiate if they're all coming out of this one branch? I'm going to have to, at this point, define a client-side action for all of them. So you might have seen it, but how am I going to make this work? How am I going to make that work so that I can actually have different actions applied to different kinds of users coming out of that one item? What was it? Adding what? If I just add one other item, is that what you said, add an item?
No, another branch based on group members.
Yes, I need to, exactly. So what I need to do is go into that item and add some new branches based on their groups, which will look kind of like that. So now I've added branch rule for employees, another branch rule for contractors, and then I have a fallback branch. I don't have to define a branch for administrators and a branch for vendors, because they're just going to not match the first two branches and they'll go the fallback branch. This is a perfect example of when the fallback branch doesn't always imply failure. And again, notice the two new branches. Start with deny. So I'm going to now add my first client-side action for my employees. This is also on the same client side where all of our antivirus and so forth was. And we're going to use the Windows cache and session control. First important thing to note there is it's called Windows cache and session control. That should tell you something about it right there. The Windows cache and session control is designed to clear out browser-related details from their session, like the files they might have, temporary files they might have downloaded, the URLs they visited, and so forth. So it's not too awful to do that to my employees. Some features in here. One of the features I really like is the ability to empty the recycle bin. So imagine this. Imagine if my employees at the airport and they're about to get on their flight and they got a couple of minutes, so they go over to one of those public kiosk computers to check their Outlook web access. And while they're there, they see an email from Francois. This is our 2018 goals for F5, confidential. So I download it to look at it. And then I'm smart enough to think, oh, I'm going to put this in the recycle bin, delete it. But I don't empty the recycle bin. So the next user that comes on that computer, they notice, oh, look, there's files in the recycle bin. I wonder what they are. And they can look at them all. So for that, we might want to make sure that we empty that recycle bin every time they log out. Which is important. So now I've got my Windows cache and session control for employees. I will, of course, want to change that ending. Then I'm going to add a different kind of client-side action for my contractors called Windows Protected Workspace. So first, let me explain what my contractors, how their work is done. So they connect to dummy desktops. So whenever they come in, they get onto a computer and they connect to a dummy desktop. And you know how users are. They waste their time by customizing the desktop and adding their own wallpaper and all this stuff, and I don't want any of that stuff saved. All I want saved is the work that they have done. So I can use this feature, but I wouldn't use it in a lot of other scenarios, because what this feature does is once they connect, it will create a new Windows session for them inside of a memory window. And this Windows session will look like their desktop. It'll have all their icons, it'll have all their applications. They can do stuff in Word and Excel and so forth. They can save it to their C drive, their D drive. They can save it to their network share. They can save it to a thumb drive. But everything they're actually doing is still in memory. Everything they're doing, even saving it to their thumb drive. And as soon as their session ends, they're going to see that nothing they've done has been saved at all. So if I did this to all my employees, we might have some serious problems when we're trying to get some progress made. But with dummy terminals, it works great, because every time they close their session, we lose all that stuff. But what about all their work they've done? All of their work. So here are just some basic settings you can configure. But more importantly is we can add network locations where they can actually save things and not lose it. And so that's where I'd want them to put all of their saved work, and then everything else we lose. And now we've got our completed policy. All of my employees will follow that branch, get Windows cache and session control. All of my contractors go to their branch, and then all of my administrators and vendors and partners go to the fallback branch, and nothing happens to them after they get their resources. Any questions on all of this? This is the hardest part of today. Kind of hardest to wrap your head around sometimes. But this is how you're going to do, as I said, everything for virtual servers and pools that you want to add user identity, access management. All this applies. Or your VPNs, whatever you're going to use APM for, you're going to use this. So you're going to now go one step farther. It is lunchtime, so let me give you kind of a synopsis of what we can do for this day. I'm going to kind of leave it up to you guys. But in this next exercise, you're going to do the next step. You've already got your resources. Now you need to define who gets those resources and then start giving some additional groups some other resources. So you're going to create, I think, 2 or 3 resource groups. And then, of course, you'll add some client-side actions, client-side checks, a client-side check, and then you're going to do a client-side action, and you'll see how all that applies. So right now it's 12 o'clock, and I would typically give 45 minutes for this and 45 minutes for lunch, which would take us all the way to 1:30. But if we trim down the lunchtime a bit and you do sort of a semi-lunch and exercise, we will just get done earlier in the day.